as I look across the frozen wasteland that was once my home. A question plagues my mind, a question which has gnawed at me for years. Do the AP kids know enough about Columbus? Hope you're enjoying this snowiest of days. I've almost changed out of my outdoor clothes. Give me 1 second. Much better. Okay, so today's lesson, if the title didn't give it away, is a continuation of what we looked at back on Thursday, wherein we talked about European exploration, and we do have to finish up one last thing. Technically, this first slide, you'll notice the color change between the groups of slides. Technically, this first one goes on our last set of notes if you're the sort of person who's that organized. Okay, so we do have to talk about which Europeans did the exploring and why it was those Europeans. So European nations that were on the edge of the continent, the ones that were closest to the Americas, were the first ones who arrived in the Americas. And that's for reasons that are fairly obvious geographically. It's easier to get to the Americas from Spain than it is from, say, Germany, even though there wasn't a Germany at this point in history. Anyhow, other countries that were prominent, we'll talk about them later, but like the Austrians. The Austrians had to deal with the Ottoman Turks. Countries like Poland and Russia had to deal with the last remnants of the Mongol hordes, so they weren't going to be able to explore. Italy was the leading exploring country, though it was a group of city-states, not really a country in Europe, but they were centrally located. They were in the Mediterranean. They were disunited and constantly fighting each other, and they were blocked from the valuable trade of the East by the Ottoman Empire. So that's why we're going to be talking about the Spanish pretty much all of today, and the Portuguese, the French, and the English as we talk about exploration. So now let's get into the meat of our lesson. There were a lot of major European explorations throughout the years. Magellan, Bartolomeo Diaz going around the southern tip of Africa, Ponce de Leon in Florida come to mind, but there's only two that you have to know for this class that are must-know pieces of information because they are what will radically alter the globe. You have Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1492, which the vast majority of you are familiar with, and the other one, which you've probably at least heard of, and of which there's a map on the side of your screen there, Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer's arrival in India in 1497. Today and tomorrow creeps along its petty pace. Oh, sorry, that's Macbeth. We're going to be looking at Columbus because it's the one you're more familiar with, but we're going to do a deeper dive, of course, than we have in other history classes. Okay, the title of this slide does sound like a bad 50s monster movie, but really, and you can feel free to put this in your margins, the closest thing to aliens landing on another planet and discovering humanity, or to humans landing on another planet and discovering intelligent life, happened in October of 1492 when the Western and Eastern hemispheres came together permanently for the first time in roughly 10,000 years. Now, the word that I want to use there that I want you to at least have in your notes is the word permanently, because this is one of those things where Christopher Columbus's reputation over the course of the past 50 years or so has taken a well-deserved beating. But with that said, it's also possible to overcorrect. Yes, the Vikings did beat the Spanish here by almost 500 years, but they didn't stay. There's some fringe historians with whom I disagree very heavily, but you do need to know the theories out there, that it's possible that the Ming Chinese actually landed on the west coast of the Americas during their time of exploration. That's great, but even if it's true, they didn't stay. The difference between the Columbian explorations and all of those others is they establish a permanent connection between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. or if you insist on using terminology that I also loathe, the Old World and the New World, the Old World being Afro-Eurasia, the New World being the Americas. Either way, this is one of the three big events. If you remember back in Unit 1, no you don't, liar, I said there's three big events in human history that change everything. The discovery of agriculture, the agricultural revolution, the Columbian Exchange, which is what we're going to be focusing on the next couple of days, and the Industrial Revolution. This is a huge, huge event. Columbus, if you need to know the details of him, he's an Italian. He's Genoese, and he is working for the Spanish. And basically his theory was that you could sail west around the globe and get to China. Technically he was correct, but he vastly underestimated the size, he vastly overestimated the size of the world, and if his crew hadn't run into the islands that they ran into, which are now the Bahamas, he probably would have starved to death out in the open ocean. But that's that. Columbus has now made contact, and let's see how that goes. Badly is the answer. So, to understand the awfulness that's going to be unfolding over the course of the next couple of days of our class, you really do need to know who you're dealing with when you talk about Renaissance era Spain. You're talking about a society that is extremely militarized and extremely hostile to people who are not like them. In 1492, Spain had completed the Reconquista. They had completed the reconquest of Spain from Muslim forces, which had taken hundreds of years and which had fostered an environment of severe religious distrust and intoleration. Keep in mind, three huge things happened in Spain in 1492. The voyages of Columbus, of course, which I guess technically didn't happen in Spain, but roll with it. The Reconquista is completed in southern Spain with the fall of the last Muslim emirate. And perhaps most jarringly at home, the King and Queen of Spain had just passed a law telling the Jews to either leave Spain or convert to Catholicism. That is a very, very intolerant environment, and that's how they're treating the Jews, who are fellow monotheists and who at least have some things in common with Christianity. Now, think about how they're going to react to seeing the Aztecs who cut people's hearts out every morning. In short, you have to imagine if a heavily militarized, angry, intolerant society were the first group of people that were met by visitors from another world. Basically, imagine if aliens landed in, I don't know, some backwater in Mississippi, and you pretty much have an idea of how this is going to go. Oh, good, Columbus. So when he gets to the Americas, Columbus's first instinct is to size up the people that he met, and he makes note of two things. One, he says that they would make good servants and could easily be Christianized because they, quote, appear to have no religion of their own, and were cutting themselves quite by accident on the swords and things that he had brought. Columbus did not have a very high opinion of the Taino Indians who inhabited the Bahamas. He also noticed that they had gold jewelry, and he was very excited by that. Columbus and his reports basically set off what is the equivalent of a land rush. Now remember, it took Europeans a while to figure out that this was a new world. They actually thought they were in Asia for a pretty good period of time, hence why Native Americans are referred to as Indians, even up and unto this day. So it did take them a while to realize that they were in somewhere that nobody on the other side of the Atlantic had ever heard of. By the by, my face is currently blocking the caption, but Christopher Columbus, no actual images of him from his lifetime exist. This is the most famous painting of him, but it comes from after his death. So please feel free to imagine Columbus looking like however you want. I choose to believe he looked like Steve Buscemi. Anywho, The Spanish arrive in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean and South America, and they rapidly conquer the major players of that region. Now, remember, if you're wondering where the Maya are, the Mayans had the Mayan classical empire had collapsed long ago, so that's why you only see the Aztecs and the Inca mentioned here. But here you have some stuff that you do need to know. In 1521, the Spanish, under Hernan Cortez, conquered Mexico's Aztec Empire, and in 1532, Francisco Pizarro, who we'll talk about a little bit more whenever we're back in class, captured the Inca emperor, the Emperor Atahualpa, basically ending the Inca Empire, even though the Incas did continue to resist until the 1570s. So now we have to have an important discussion, though. How on earth were the Spanish, who were outnumbered in all of these battles, how on earth were they able to rapidly conquer extremely powerful empires? Well, you already know this, or you should at least. The Spanish were outnumbered, yes, but the natives had their own society. They were no more unified than Europeans were. And as a result, the Spanish and later other Europeans were able to play natives against one another. For example, in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs were able to recruit a lot of those people, like the Tlaxcala, who the Aztecs had spent the last 100 years or so sacrificing. They saw the Spanish as an opportunity to get rid of the hated Aztecs. They didn't know the Spanish. They didn't know the horrible things the Spanish were going to do, so you can forgive them for that. The Inca had finished fighting a civil war. The previous Inca emperor before Atahualpa had actually died of smallpox, which we'll talk about in a second. And the result was that the Inca upper class was not a united front, and several upper class Inca actually settled down and became farmers after the Spanish conquered them because they saw the Spanish as an opportunity to get out from under an emperor who they hated. The other big thing that enabled Europeans to conquer the natives with relative speed, again starting with the Spanish, but we will see other Europeans show up shortly, is technology. The steel armor and steel weaponry, as well as gunpowder weaponry that you can see on our conquistador on the right there, as well as horses, which of course bring a new thing onto the battlefield. It's very easy to stab downward from a horse and kill somebody. According to the sources I've read, I've never done it. It's much harder to reach up and attack, and that steel armor is pretty much impervious to most native weaponry. You had to hit the Spaniards in unarmored places, which was pretty difficult to do. You'll also notice that the song of the day is Conquistador by Procol Harum. Listen to the 1972 edition with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra. Great trumpet part in there. However, the most notable thing that the Europeans brought over, and the most devastating by far, as we'll see, and you already knew this, are the Afro-Eurasian diseases, the smallpox, the measles, etc., that came accidentally with the Europeans when they arrived. Disease is and always has been a major player on the stage of global history, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the disaster that hit the Americas at this point in time. In the aftermath of European arrival, they brought over germs that natives hadn't been exposed to, and while things were certainly bad for the societies of North America, because those were more spread out, you had more localized outbreaks. Down in the urban centers of the Valley of Mexico, as well as throughout the Inca Empire, the result was a disaster. This chart staggers me every time I see it, the one on the right-hand side of the slide. Native Americans hadn't developed resistance to diseases, some of which would still devastate us, like if there were a smallpox outbreak or a measles outbreak. Vaccinate you kids, dang it. Typhoid, that sort of thing is still very dangerous to the average person, but things like the flu, I mean, huge numbers of you guys watching this have had the flu before, but your body is equipped to deal with it. The natives, they weren't, and the result is a massive crash. You see, within 100 years, somewhere between 50 and 90% of the native population of the Americas were dead. And that's a huge range. I am fully aware of that. But the problem is that there were no censuses, so it really depends on how bad you want to make colonization look. But even if you're arguing, oh, colonization wasn't such a bad thing, it only killed half the natives, that's still a pretty terrible argument. One other thing, you'll notice on our chart over here that there is a disease that I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of, but it is called kokolitzli, which is the Nahua word for pestilence, and we're actually not 100% sure what that is, but the symptoms are as follows. If you have these symptoms, go to the hospital. What's wrong with you? Fever, headache, vertigo, black tongue, dark urine, severe abdominal and chest pain, bleeding from the nose, eyes, and mouth. You might have kokolitzli. And again, go to the hospital. Anyway, there's actually some really fascinating studies that have been done on that very recently, maybe telling us what disease that was specifically. I would send those out to you, but then you would make fun of me on Remind again, like that article that I sent out earlier. Okay, so why on earth are we now transitioning from the Great Dying to the Little Ice Age? Well, I'll explain that. In the early 1500s, global temperatures experienced a noticeable decline. If you look on the map on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll notice that aside from Iceland and a few isolated pockets in Africa and the Pacific Ocean, the vast majority of the world experienced much colder temperatures for a period of time. And we've taken to calling this the Little Ice Age. It runs from the 1500s up till the early 1700s, and it produces shorter growing seasons, and that impacts global food stocks. Now, what I am about to tell you is very controversial. It's heavily debated. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it is in Strayer. It's a pretty reliable book, and you might get asked about the Little Ice Age. There's some evidence that the cause of the Little Ice Age was the massive die-off of Native Americans. The idea was, hey, all of those people, there's now less deforestation, so there's more trees, which means more CO2 is being pulled out of the air, which lowers global temperatures. Now, keep in mind, we have seen climates change before in this class. Climates change naturally. This very easily could have been just a 200-year cold snap. With that said, it could have been exacerbated by all of those Native Americans dying. You just need to know that during this time period, there was a cold snap in global temperatures. And that matters for one last reason, which I promise is the last slide. The Little Ice Age has crushing effects around the globe. Cold summers in Europe, droughts in China and the Americas create famine all over the globe. Of course, if you survive a famine, you're not going to be as healthy, so endemic diseases have much more common outbreaks because they're hitting less healthy populations. And all of those catastrophes produce social unrest, which causes a whole lot of wars, which kills millions upon millions of people. The 1600s are a legitimate candidate for the worst century in human history, and I say that as somebody who is fully aware of what happens in the 1900s and the 1800s in most of the rest of the world. But regardless, we're talking about a very, very, very bad century for humanity, and fair warning, we're going to be looking at that century multiple times in multiple continents over the course of the rest of Unit 4. Hey, I am sorry that this ran as long as it did. I hope you are enjoying your snow day. You are going to have quizzes on these videos whenever we get back, so stand warned of that. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or thoughts, please feel free to send them to me. I hope that this 18 minutes was valuable to you, and I will see you all at some point in time before Christmas, hopefully. Bye.